We now come to the first keynote address of the afternoon, after which we have a panel. But our first speaker is Dr. Shumeet Banerji from India, family originally from Calcutta. He graduated from the Kellogg School of Management in Northwestern outside Chicago, began his career with Booz, and you may say he is Mr. Booz, because he has gone through one phase after another. He taught briefly, I think, at the University of Chicago, but he has gone from one senior position at Booz to be at present the Chief Executive Officer of Booz Company, and he's been focusing particularly on helping government ministries and financial service institutions dealing with the problem he's going to talk about, which is leadership of financial institutions, new challenges in the era of the state. Would you give a welcome, please, to Dr. Banerji?
Mr. Chairman, distinguished delegates, it's always difficult going after lunch, but I must say this is an impressive symposium, and it's been a great pleasure so far for two reasons. One has been the exceptional quality of the speakers so far, and I think I'm going to introduce some reversion to the mean as we begin this afternoon. The second, of course, is the great pleasure of being at one of these things with so many bright students. I used to be, as you did point out, on the faculty of the University of Chicago, and many years ago, when George Stigler won his Nobel Prize, a clever young reporter, the sort where the question matters more than the answer, sort of asked him at the press conference whether it was true that he practiced the Socratic method, sit upon a log and converse with the student, to which he said, "I prefer to sit upon the student and converse with the log." This is not why I left Chicago, and I promise to be kind to your questions as you come along. So, turning to the topic at hand, much of what is in this speech has already been said by wiser people than I, but I've prepared it, so you're going to hear it. So, a few weeks ago, I was in a meeting with some senior officials in the UK government, and I asked of them how the economy looked from the senior government perspective, and to which she said, well, it looks about average. To which I said, average? She said, yes, and that's because the economy is worse than last week, but better than next week. So in preparation for this talk, I spoke with a number of very senior bankers in major institutions around the world, in New York, London, Amsterdam, and in Zurich, and I would say that the state of the leaderships of major global financial institutions is about average as well. My intention is to explore their challenges, but also those of central bankers, regulators, and indeed politicians in what we might call the world according to TARP. It's a hard time to be in the leadership of a major global financial institution nowadays. I hasten to add, this is not only true of leaders of banks with significant government funding, but of financial institutions in general, all described in the new pejorative banker, which is kind of the big bad word of the day. And the public charges, of course, are familiar, of bringing the world to its knees by taking breathtaking risks on the spur of astronomical compensation with little regard for the consequences. The spectacle has been lively. It is now customary for bank CEOs and chairmen to be hauled before Treasury Select Committees, House subcommittees, and so forth, ostensibly to improve the public's understanding of the antecedents of these events, but also, no doubt, to indignantly demand an abject apology from contrite executives. Fred Goodwin's had a brick through his sitting room window and his car tires slashed. The Swiss press reports that a prominent ex-banker was drummed out from a Zurich restaurant by an impromptu jury of his fellow diners just before Christmas. And the iconic image of this crisis for me was that of Andy Hornby handing over HBOS to Eric Daniels at a press conference, a fallen Icarus. Yes, but he deserved it, say your dinner party guests. And I can certainly vouch for the hesitation bankers feel in declaring themselves of their profession at dinner parties. There's a harder edge to some of these developments. The combination of the President's comment to the CEOs of America's biggest banks to the effect that all that stands between you and the pitchforks is my administration, juxtaposed with Rahm Emanuel's droll observation that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste, invites some speculation. Perhaps a debt obligation, you owe me, coupled with a social engineering project. The bus tours of the homes of AIG executives may seem harmlessly amusing, but the threat from Andrew Cuomo, New York's Attorney General, to publish the names of those who had not returned their bonuses strikes me as bordering on an invitation to march with pitchforks, and from a government official at that. Said simply, it's not only not much fun being a banker, it might be downright dangerous. My thesis is that it's time to stop and take stock of the unintended and certainly undesirable consequences of the bloodletting and vilification of the industry. Even though possibly unintended, in some places in the world, the sum of actions seems to increasingly risk the creation of a low beta, low innovation environment populated with modest talent, where credit is essentially socialized. And this would happen at precisely the time that we need the best minds of the major global institutions to fix them, but also reinvent their business models. I recognize that defending bankers is a minority occupation these days, and some might view my lonely defense as foolhardy, unjust, misinformed, or even self-serving. Let me make sure I'm even-handed by clearly asserting that major mistakes were made at the banks. And I must say, of course, that they have provided much of this analysis themselves. Let me pass the list down to some of the key themes as I see them. First, the banks were clearly over-leveraged and took little account of liquidity risk. Second, even when the characteristics of an unsustainable asset bubble were evident to many, the inexorable logic of a particular asset's quality was still driving transactions that wouldn't have happened if banks were more focused on portfolio risk. Technically, I think this is known as the Chuck Prince axiom, which involves music and dancing from last July. Third, as we saw in the autumn, seemingly uncorrelated, if not orthogonal risks, largely become correlated when the underlying machine of the economy turns down, and not enough institutions focused on systemic risk. Fourth, the originate-distribute model, by the end of things, was originating terrible underwriting risks, in their turn only taken because they could be repackaged and sold on, whilst the distributors were inadequately focused on the underlying asset quality or diversification, having outsourced much of that function to ratings agencies. And finally, it must be acknowledged that compensation played a major role. The payout half of paper profits model clearly had the wrong architecture. Heads I win, tails you lose. What my game theory professors, inspired by Hurwitz, would describe as lacking incentive compatibility with the good of the principles. So, obviously a very serious set of failings and an enormous agenda for reform. For these errors, these institutions and their protagonists have paid and are paying a terrible price, and that is only fair and right. Common shareholders' value has been cut by 90% plus, many have lost jobs, and many that remain are in financial mourning, a lovely term that I heard in Australia, which really has to do with the fact that their net worths have been drastically reduced, because in fact most of their wealth was in long-term company performance. For their leaders, though, the environment is relentless. Most of those who, quote-unquote, created the problem are gone, leaving the current cohort with a reputational risk of failure without the associated upside. This is because compensation will no doubt be capped by rather blunt means, implying that those running, for example, Citigroup, will be paid not much more than, say, however deserving, an associate professor of finance. And all of this in an environment where the vocational hazard is multiplied by the capacity of blame to unerringly find its most visible victim, which is, of course, the bankers. My purpose is not to blunt the criticism of bankers, rather it is to point out, as I've written elsewhere, that this is a compound crisis, and there are lessons to be learned from it by all players in the ecosystem. To understand why, it is worth rehearsing the other culpability argument. And this has been done rather well by preceding speakers, but just to summarize, the scale of the problem at hand is unimaginable without the global imbalances between surplus countries and consuming countries that have characterized at least the last decade. A world awash in liquidity drove low interest rates, in turn passed on to institutions and consumers through central bank rate policies. Governments, including prominently in the US and the UK, encouraged a consumer-led growth strategy, intervening directly to lend where the markets would not do enough, as in the case of Fannie Mae and low net worth households. In their turn, regulators and their colleges spent effort worrying about individual firms, even in multilateral reform projects such as Basel. They also took on some rather exotic projects, such as those directed at addressing various forms of consumer harm stemming from, frankly, vague notions of fairness, such as in the UK. But importantly, no one had the responsibility to assess systemic risk on either the national or the global level. With central banks worrying about inflation and monetary policy, multiple regulators generally taking the light touch nudge of their governments, and governments focused on growth, but also the expenditure of soaring revenues the tax system generated with growth for various purposes, such as the poverty alleviation measures in the UK. Two other sets of actors also deserve attention. Ratings agencies played a major role in the crisis, but still evade the determined scrutiny of their practices that the primary institutions have received. And it must be said, consumer responsibility has not been exemplary, to say the least. Possibly explained by low levels of financial literacy, but nevertheless, leading to household indebtedness as a percentage of disposable income rising from 100 to 175% from 2000 to 2007 in the UK. And of course, Lord Griffiths, you've written extensively on this topic of indebtedness. So in this context, the role of the banks, in particular the 10 to 12 major global institutions, as intermediaries, culpable but nevertheless intermediaries in these global flows, must be acknowledged. They distributed cheap credit to consumers, securitized the underlying assets, resold them in various tranches to their customers, such as insurers and pension funds, who needed and demanded these securities to improve asset liability matching. They made the errors pointed out earlier, but did so in a context which was far larger than them, and importantly, in full view of the regulators. In short, the current version of the story, in fact, exaggerates their role as masters of the universe. Some humility in acknowledging this is what I am suggesting, and a stronger expression of the need to find broader answers to the crisis than to merely point at one set of protagonists. The innovativeness, dynamism, and globality of the financial system risks serious impairment. The characteristics of what is happening now are in a sense similar to the dynamics that drove the crisis in the first place. Individual actors maximizing their self-interest created a credit-led asset bubble. I would assert that self-interest, by the way, does more than simply explain the behavior of profit-motivated actors. Likewise, today, I fear individual actors under somewhat different operating assumptions will make individually rational and collectively suboptimal decisions for the global system, even though the individual decisions of each single politician, regulator, and central banker may be understandable and even rational. The collective consequences of a populist agenda will be less global, less innovative, and less talented financial institutions. And this cannot serve us well. We have a lot to do. Our future remains to be defined. The blame game has to move to the end game. I'll close by introducing 4 issues and their tentative implications, including for financial institution leadership. First, what accommodations are necessary to acknowledge the role of governments as the underwriter of last resort? The banking industry has operated in a world which Nouriel Roubini has called one of privatized profit and socialized risk. The model has 2 fundamental features: a structural mismatch between the tenor of assets and liabilities that several have referred to, what the minister described rather well as well, and secondly, undiversifiable credit risk. The largest institutions have assets that, when added across a national system, result in exposures far greater than GDP of all but the biggest economies. As a result, this places governments in the position of being the underwriter of last resort for increasingly unwieldy institutions and raises the question, do we save the bank or the country? These are banks that are too big to fail, but they're also too big to bail. I do not believe governments want this role. The Washington consensus the last 25 years, in fact, has led OECD governments to adopt fundamental principles such as intervening at the level of the economy, not at the level of firms, or to avoid picking winners and losers, whether at the level of industries or firms. But confronted with catastrophic failure, governments have had to act and had no choice but to intervene in both ways. Much recent attention has focused on how to prevent catastrophic failures. And I'm sure we will successfully prevent this one from happening again, at least for a few decades. The only thing that is reasonably clear is systemic failure will happen again. The IMF tells us there have been 124 systemic banking crises since 1970, though not on this scale, obviously. Citigroup alone has been over the brink 3 times in the last 30 years. It's easy for us to forget that. I conclude, therefore, that the government's permanent role as underwriters of last resort must be acknowledged. Raises basic questions. Today, this implicit government guarantee is essentially free. How will governments price their role as underwriters of last resort? Will that be via nonlinear taxation on global, locally headquartered companies? By creating pooled insurance schemes, such as for deposit insurance in the savings world? Should pooling schemes be global for global institutions? For global banks, which are more diversified and maybe more profitable, will a new explicit covenant with management and shareholders be necessary? Will shareholders understand that government is an equal stakeholder and may require banks to act in systemic best interests, thereby perhaps reducing the attractiveness of banks to shareholders, but aligning shareholder returns closer to the real economics of banks over the cycle? Second, will banking have structurally lower return on equity? A major thrust of repair activity in the last months has been on strengthening the capital positions of the major institutions. And various classes of moves have happened. Several have been mentioned. The emphasis on tangible common equity rather than conventional Tier 1 capital, counter-cyclical provisioning, and nonlinear and convex provisioning in assets, so large institutions have disproportionately higher capital. I'm not debating the merits of these proposals here, but rather note that the consequence is likely to be higher capital requirements against the 2007 baseline. Combine this with lower leverage and the evaporation of important profit pools, such as those emanating from structured products, do imply depressed banking ROEs for some time to come, making capital more scarce or more expensive or both, and therefore implications for national growth rates. For institutional leadership's obvious challenges, can a global model compensate for depressed profitability, particularly as marginal players exit and withdraw to domestic markets? Will markets price in the advantage of a putatively lower risk of catastrophic failure? Third, will banks be smaller and more local? In a world of global operations and national recourse in crisis, many countries are grappling with how to cope. As long as the system depends on recourse to the country where a bank's headquarters are, it seems inevitable that at least some institutions, such as the Royal Bank of Scotland, at one time the largest lender to Sweden, will shrink and revert to a much more local profile. For many countries, the risks of supporting global institutions are high and even threaten sovereign default. For example, as we've noted earlier, Austrian banking exposure to Eastern Europe is 80% of GDP. In the absence of a pooled or a multilateral recourse system, it seems likely that only the very largest economies, the US and perhaps Japan, will be able to afford large banks. In addition, the global trend towards protectionism challenges banking globality. Two forms, regulatory and trade. Jurisdictions around the world are demanding that global banks hold capital locally to secure their local operations, which will make it likely that operations will have to shrink to match local capital, given the inefficiency of fragmenting capital, but also the illiquidity of many national capital markets. Second, in spite of protestations to the contrary, trade protection is clearly on the rise, so that banks who depend on financing global trade will shrink. Although partly a result of the global recession, it's worth noting that global credit flow declined by $4.8 trillion last year, about 14%. Hence some questions. Do we want global banks? If the US is one of only a few economies with the scale to support global institutions, will other nations feel the need to pick national champions, as in the case of the airline industry? Top 3 banks in the world by capitalization are Chinese. Will the dominance of global banking become a global security issue in terms of the economics? Last point I'll make is, will we have the capability and capacity to lead global financial institutions, and should we care? I began by saying it's a hard time to be in these leadership roles. Here's why. First, the question of compensation. At current quantitative caps or tax system workarounds being proposed by governments, there is a real danger that these jobs are not worth the trouble, especially when the public scrutiny and hostility and the reputational risks are considered. A commitment to public service or a narcissistic attraction to mission impossible situations cannot be enough to sustain a global banking system. Second, the question of who your boss is. It's now clear that a broader set of stakeholders will need to be considered than merely shareholders. But has anyone told the shareholders? The fact that Ken Lewis is no longer chairman of Bank of America presumably has something to do with investor displeasure at the Merrill acquisition, which one would presume had more than a little persuasive support from the Fed and the Treasury. Is this contradiction of direction, one from shareholders and the other from government, reconcilable? Third, some of these institutions may be just too big and too complex for traditional management structures. The solutions are not obvious. Smaller banks, smarter people, better MI, better risk management, more focused models. My point is that even holding the first two issues aside, These are high-risk jobs. It is right for us to collectively worry about the environment in which these leaders will operate. Parenthetically, I also mentioned the corollary problem, which is that of talent per se. Good people are leaving banks. Moreover, attracting good new ones will get harder. The insertion of restrictions on H-1B visas for TARP institutions in the legislation is an example of a populist agenda being played through which cannot make any sense. Fundamentally, do we care about talent in financial institutions? Do we care about morale and motivation? What is the covenant between bankers and society 3 years from now? So let me close by saying that even as the public indignation burns bright, there's much work to be done. I believe the desirable globality of the institutions drives us towards a preference for multilateral solutions versus the national angle that has prevailed so far, notwithstanding the comments of the Minister about the Financial Stability Board. That is hard enough in a world of global problems and national governance, but these times are a real test of political leadership for another reason. It's easier to play to the galleries than explain the complexities of causality and the role all constituents have played in this crisis. I do not believe private sympathy and public silence is enough. We must ask our leaders to do more, to explain, rise above the short-term political expediencies, get beyond retribution, and engage in real dialogue so the task of rebuilding can be engaged. Thank you for your attention.
Questions?
Wherever you like.
Shall we sit down?
Yeah, sure.
I wonder if we can have the lights on again. Dr. Banerji, thank you very much indeed for that presentation. You packed so much into that speech at such a pace. I was breathless after about 5 minutes, and I tried to take notes, and there are so many questions to be asked. Who would like to? A gentleman there, and then a gentleman behind. Gentleman in the white shirt first, and then a gentleman in the end of the aisle second.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Christian Rosner. I'm from Austria. You are mentioning again the risk of the Austrian debts, you call it Austrian debts, in Eastern Europe. First of all, and the first speaker, Mr. Smick, said emerging markets are dangerous for Austria. So first of all, do you believe that Eastern Europe is one consistent summary of countries? Mr. Smick, I wanted to ask him if emerging markets are really consistent, or can you imagine that Poland is quite different from Moldavia or from Romania and backwards to Czechia or Slovenia?
Well, obviously, I'm making a very broad point, as was Mr. Smick, I think, about this, but I would also hold that I think that there are quite serious problems in Eastern Europe. I do think that that Ireland and Iceland are not isolated situations. And I think that we have major economies in Europe, but also in Eastern Europe, that are at severe risk. And I think that we cannot rule out a year in which we have further incidences of sovereign default. So you're quite right that all of Eastern Europe, or all emerging markets for that matter, are not the same and have quite different macroeconomics. But I also do think that these exposures are quite serious. It is an illustrative point rather than one that suggests that Austria is on the bank of sovereign default. But I think that, generally speaking, the point I'm making, though, is nevertheless stands, which is that for banks, even in countries the size of Austria, the accumulation of global asset portfolios leads to exposures which are substantially larger than GDP. So the point I'm making is a rather different one, which is that national recourse following that situation implies that you have some very tough choices to make unless you're able to engage a multilateral recourse system. So, for example, where the bailout of RBS is not just a UK government issue, but also one for Sweden. That's kind of the point I'm making, which is that it would be helpful to explore multilateral strategies rather than national recourse. Otherwise, we risk global banking. I'm not actually suggesting anything about Austria. My apologies if it seemed that way.
Gentleman in the aisle.
Thank you. My name is Alexei. I come from Russia. In your speech, you mentioned the importance of governments in dealing with financial issues. And in this case, I'm kind of following your point on multilateralism in decision-making. What I'm saying is governments are not exactly the same thing in different countries. For example, in the European Union, you have different levels of governance. I mean, you have subnational level, you have supranational level, you also have international financial institutions. So it may be not only multilateral, but also multi-level decision making. And also it probably should involve both public and private entities. And I guess it might also be on global scale. G8 and G20 have kind of been moving in this direction, but there is no like decision-making formula or any architecture that can be sustainable in these institutions. So I'm asking if you see any future architecture for international financial governance that would involve both public and private institutions. Thank you.
I think that institutions are emerging, rather rapidly in response to the demand for that level of multilateralism. But the fact remains that as the Minister pointed out earlier, that the core basis of the architecture that exists today is national. And that is problematic because I personally believe that, in answer to my somewhat rhetorical questions, that we need global financial institutions, that they have in fact been on balance extraordinarily good for the world in the last 25 years. But the structures we have today are probably inadequate to help us get there. I think the FSB is a good start, the College of Supervisors is a good start, but just as we were compelled to create the IMF after the war to deal with questions of macroeconomic stability around the world, I think we will need to look at institutional frameworks to do that as well, rather more rapidly than the current pace of conversation seems to suggest.
Gentleman there.
Hi, I am Harsh from India. What we have heard since morning is a lot of discussion upon... I am Harsh from India. Since morning we have heard a lot of discussion about how the big banks are affected by the present financial crisis. But what I would like to know is that there are a lot of areas, both business areas and geographical areas, which do not have adequate infrastructure, financial infrastructure. How are these areas affected by this crisis, or what is the impact of the crisis on these areas?
Well, I think I'm not a macroeconomist, so I think you might find better answers from some other distinguished panelists here. But I think that if you looked at, if you take the case of India, for example, the relatively heavy hand of regulation from the RBI was something banks complained about, as they did in Canada, by the way, and in Australia. But when you're in a crisis, everyone then applauds the central bank and says, jolly good chaps, they kept us out of this mess, didn't let us merge, didn't let us do this or that or the other. In fact, it's ironic that the intention of the Canadian banks when the Royal Bank and so forth wanted to merge, Bank of Montreal wanted to merge, was to create a continental-sized player. They've achieved that quite nicely now. They are 4 of the top 10 banks in North America, but without really doing very much different from what they've done in the past. But that's a different story. But if you look at the case of India, I think that for quite some time, in the September-ish time frame last year, there was a sense that India would escape the bullet. And in fact, the banking system was reasonably well capitalized, had no exposure to these asset classes, and leverage ratios were reasonably good, liquidity was reasonably good. What turned out, though, was the impact on Indian banking came from the fact that global credit froze up. And even though it was a small part of capital formation in India, the impact of that thin end of the wedge, which brought other things with it, like ratings and so on and so forth, had a pretty significant impact on credit. So the impact really is from a point several people have made, which is global interconnectedness, that nobody out there today is on their own. There might be a couple of exceptions, but so that I think is the impact. It is that the global financial system is in fact global, and it was really rather than on the asset failure side of things, it was on the fact that credit froze up.
Gentleman there.
I'm Saron from Hong Kong. Dr. Banerji, so you mentioned the blaming and the vilification of the financial industry in the past year. How do you think this is influencing the global economy, especially in this time of an economic recession? And how do you think the financial industry can recover and rebuild the reputation in this kind of situation, which perhaps reputation rebuilding is more difficult than making the banks being capitally softened again? Thanks very much.
Good question. I think that the impact is in the way that I described, which is that I think that, in fact, having very talented people in global capital markets matters. And I think that the environment in which these people are operating is really very harsh. It's a very hostile environment. And I do think, actually, that I was very, very pleased to hear what the President said earlier today, as well as the Minister from Singapore. But that's not the tenor of a lot of voices out there right now. Okay. Now, is blame appropriate in this situation? Absolutely. And I said as much in my comments. My point, of course, is that they didn't do it on their own. They're good, but they're not that good. Okay. Bring the world down on its knees takes a little more effort than just securitization. And I think, it takes some political leadership to actually acknowledge this in the face of the fact that the electorate is justifiably really annoyed about this. And I'm afraid we're not seeing enough of that. So my point is simply that it would be helpful to get a somewhat more balanced dialogue going about what this is about, because I think that we risk the global nature and the innovativeness of these institutions. Make no mistake, it's vital for the world. So the second part of your question was?
Rebuilding confidence.
Well, I think that, as soon as there is a chance for a dialogue to be engaged, there are a lot of very, very smart people in the banks thinking very hard about not only their institutions but what the world should look like. And I think it would be helpful for, in particular, regulators and central banks to start a genuine dialogue, because the reality is the banks know the banks better than anyone outside the banks knows the banks. Okay, and so this kind of dialogue is really pretty crucial, because I don't think anybody at those institutions has any interest in systemic failure. They don't particularly sit around plotting, kind of world destruction. They're thinking about other things. But I also think that there is some stuff to be done from there as well. I think that, for example, I do worry quite a bit about, there's been a big swing towards first quarter results, fabulous first quarter results. I think there's been a lot of one-time things that went into those numbers, and it would be helpful if bank CEOs were much more open about that. That this isn't just kind of fabulous, everything is good and green shoots are here. It's spring and it's time to sing, together. I think it isn't that good, and I think it would be helpful to be more transparent about this. I think we need to hear more about commercial risks. I think commercial real estate is a big problem. I think we have really big issues around Europe as well, which, I think it would be helpful if bank leadership stood up and talked about more openly. It will help an atmosphere of trust to at least be able to say, look, these are the things we're worrying about, rather than good news stories again.
Final question. That's right. Gentleman, I think, his hand up.
Good afternoon. I'm RJ from the Philippines. Is it fair to expect that national governments will react the same way, will react to incentives the same way as private banking institutions? And if not, how can the global economy pressure governments to react in a particular way? I think this question applies to governments in developing countries, because interests mix with incentives and risks, and sometimes national governments use this crisis to further their political ambitions as well as to further personal interests. Thank you.
Well, I think the last part of your question is the answer. Right? The point I was making simply is that this is a complex game, and in fact, I would urge you to attend Professor Auman's session later this afternoon. He's one of the world's most eminent game theorists. It is that you can understand political systems applying the same game theory principles as you can in understanding economic systems. You just said it, that politicians respond to perhaps different kinds of incentives, but they're political incentives around power and electorates. And the reality is that privately, senior politicians who are very smart people will tell you that they believe that a certain set of things needs to happen. And that was my point about private sympathy and public silence. It isn't good enough to stand up in a small circle of people, senior people over lunch, and say, no, I'm with you, and everything will be all right. But when the vilification starts in public, you don't actually stand up and do anything about it because you're facing an election year. So, that's kind of the logic of most democratic situations, or even quasi-democratic situations.